Next, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Kevin Steinmetz, who is a professor at Kansas State University. Kevin, over to you.
All right, thanks, Tom. So now in the words of Monty Python, now for something completely different. And what I want to talk to you all about today is my research on social engineering, or the manipulation of the people involved in information security. And this is what I'm presenting to you are the results out of a recent study published in Victims and Offenders, looking at the characteristics that people who do social engineering ascribe to vulnerable victims. Prior research has cataloged the various techniques that social engineers use, the various psychological tendencies said to be exploited by them, the various biases and emotions that they use. They've looked at the content of fraudulent emails to see what might make people susceptible to them. They've done experiments to look at how people discern between licit and illicit emails. And studies have also cataloged the various demographic, personality, dispositional characteristics associated with fraud victims, as well as like routine activities that seem to be associated with fraud victim characteristics or fraud victimization. But none of these studies really try to look at how individuals who do social engineering view victim vulnerability. So from their perspective, what makes for a vulnerable victim? And so we thought it would be interesting to do this type of analysis to just add a different perspective on the academic literature. And so we did qualitative interviews with both professional and non-professional social engineers as part of a bigger National Science Foundation funded research study. Professional social engineers refer to security auditors or penetration testers who use social engineering techniques in the course of their job. So doing phishing attacks, phishing, in-person engagements, whatever, but they engage the social side of information security as part of their job to test organizational security. It also involves non-professionals, which may involve people who have criminal backgrounds or who were hobbyists or were working toward becoming professionals. Just real quick on the demographic characteristics of our sample. It reflects other studies on hackers or related technologists in that it's mostly white, mostly male, relatively educated. And while most people say they're middle class, in this case, the self-identified socioeconomic status was largely middle class. And that's probably pretty accurate. Most of them were fairly well-to-do or from well-to-do backgrounds. So once we gathered this sample using largely purposive and snowball sampling techniques, where we went out to hacker conferences and tried to recruit people into our study and then ask them to refer us to other people, we looked through their responses about how they described what makes for a good or bad target, what makes for a vulnerable versus resilient target. And we came up with 6 themes that I'll walk you through in this analysis. And then when I'm done talking about these themes that bubbled up out of this inductive analysis, where we tried to find patterns or trends that manifested within the participant responses, I'll talk about some theoretical implications, or at least social scientific theoretical implications. So the first theme that manifested in their responses when we asked them about victim vulnerability is probably the most obvious, that someone is more likely to be vulnerable to social engineering and become targeted if they have something to social engineer once. In other words, they're prized. Whether they have money, authority, information, these can all make somebody a target. Also, some participants noted that someone may be considered a good victim if they promise a good time to the social engineer. There are just apparently some targets that are more fun to go after than others. So one quote that demonstrates how authority can make somebody a potential target was given by Mark, which is a pseudonym. He says, if I can manipulate an executive at a high level, I can get that person to transfer $50 million, right? If I call someone at a very junior level, they don't have the rights, permissions, and authority to be able to do any of that. So for him, the fact that that person is a high-ranking executive with authority to make changes within the organization makes them more vulnerable. So what they offer the social engineer can make for a vulnerable victim. But it also is about the degree of knowledge of security risks that a person has that can make them vulnerable. In this case, they're uninformed, either because of ignorance or a lack of proper training. So for example, Edna says you want to avoid someone who's been trained. She also says, you want to go after interns and new hires because they don't know any better. They don't understand the idiosyncrasies of the organization. They don't understand the particular kinds of risks that their decisions may create. So we've got prized, uninformed, ignorant, not knowledgeable. But it's also possible that a person just doesn't care about information security. I apologize, my head's blocking some of the text here. There are some people who might full well know the risks that their decisions may pose for themselves or in organizations. They just don't care. These people might be passive, complacent, apathetic, or otherwise unwilling to inquire, investigate, or halt a deceptive encounter. So Ida talks about retail workers. She says she likes to go after retail workers because they're just not paid enough. They're not committed to the organization. They're just there for their hourly paycheck, and they're probably not going to be working that position for very long. So they're probably not going to care if their decisions might create a security vulnerability for their organization or sometimes for themselves. What participants also seem to ascribe to vulnerable victims is that they are very outgoing. They're very helpful, they're gregarious, they're friendly, they're talkative. These are people who are going to probably be willing to divulge too much information to the social engineer and give them a little too much access and be willing to facilitate an illegitimate request. As Zeb described, he likes super friendly targets because they're more susceptible, especially when I'm super friendly with them because we're both super friendly and now we're both just super friends. On the other side, participants would often argue that you want to avoid the people who are rude, who just have a scowl on their face or who have just a certain mannerism in their voice, because those people are likely to shut you down early on in your deception. The next theme is a little more complicated. This refers to the degree of connection that people have to others in terms of their social networks, the types of relationships they curate to people. And in this way, a person might be vulnerable if they are either underconnected or overconnected to others. So when talking about underconnected, we're talking about people who are relatively isolated socially, who may be working remotely, who don't have a whole lot of people to check in on them, to curb their behavior, to tell them when they're engaging in a bad decision, or they're just lonely and may be easily suckered in by the promise of some sort of social contact. Particularly people who are vulnerable to romance scams might fall into this category. On the other hand, we also have people who are over-connected. Now, this usually refers to people who maintain a number of really superficial social connections, particularly over social media. They may have 100, 1,000 friends on Facebook, for example. And now it's impossible probably for that person to have a really deep, intimate knowledge of any of those. For social engineers, these people have a whole bunch of openings for them to approach and to pretext as someone in their social network. And that person, because they have such a diffuse social network, is not really going to know enough to challenge a potentially illegitimate pretext. And so in this way, this variable or this theme works in a curvilinear fashion. If you're at either end of the poles, either you have very few social connections, you're isolated, lonely, you may be vulnerable, or if you have a number of connections, but they're relatively superficial, that may create vulnerabilities for you. So ideally, you want some good social networks. You don't want to be lonely. You want to be connected to others, but not so many that they become superficial. The next theme refers to social control. And by social control, we criminologists use this term to refer to the degree of internal regulation a person may have to govern their own behavior, or the degree in which a person's social environment can act to constrain their worst behaviors or impulses. And in this way, it's possible, according to participants, for a person to be vulnerable because they either experience too little control over their behavior or too much control over their behavior. So when we talk about under control, this refers to people who might be arrogant, impulsive, think they're above the rules, or poorly trained and supervised. So Walter says you have a person who considers themselves authoritative and that they decide for themselves what is right and what is wrong, whether the policies actually apply to them. Those types of people are not going to be properly constrained by the rules governing the behavior of an organization and may therefore be vulnerable to manipulation by social engineers. Over-controlled are people who respond a little too well to authority and control. These are people who may feel they have no autonomy, no agency. They are too willing to cow to authority. So for example, Zeke says that he likes to dress up as a high-ranking executive for an organization, go into a parking lot, and then approach people who look to be further down the ladder, because for him, those people are going to be willing to genuflect to someone who looks like an authority figure. They're not going to feel like they can challenge that person in a way that would be conducive to proper security. In this way, they're over-controlled. They have little agency in that situation. So we have these characteristics that we could combine together, like Captain Planet say, with our powers combined, we have a model victim, this ideal person who would be particularly susceptible to social engineering. This is important, at least theoretically, for a number of reasons. One way we can think about these traits is if we draw back to symbolic interactionism, or particularly the work of Erving Goffman. And in one of his later works in 1971, he borrows this term from zoological research called the Umwelt, which is this perceptual region around a person, quote, from within which signs for alarm can come. This is like a gazelle out on the Serengeti who may see a lion off in the distance, and they don't immediately get up and run, but it's only when that lion acts a certain way and comes within a certain distance that the gazelle gets up and bolts. Applied to deception, like social engineering, the Umwelt refers to the ability of a person or a mark to identify the ill intent or deceit of an actor during a social encounter. So to slip through this metaphorical perimeter, the social engineer has to accomplish one or both of the following tasks. They first have to create a ruse designed to avoid presenting signs of alarm, or important for this analysis, they have to choose a mark less likely to avoid signs of, or to identify signs of alarm. So a target with a weaker Umwelt may be uninformed about the signs of alarm, about the risks related to information security. In other words, they have fewer alarms to trip. The social engineer may also not raise suspicion within the Umwelt if the target does not prioritize the identification and mitigation of security risks. In a sense, the alarms may be present but ignored or disabled. Further, a mark may not register signs of alarm if they're friendly, helpful, or otherwise outgoing in their disposition. Their guard will be lowered for the sake of facilitating and encouraging social engagement. These traits thus impact the permeability of this perceptual zone of disquiet of the mark. Participant responses indicate that this zone may be bolstered through efforts to educate individuals on security risks and investments to promote the prioritization of information security among relevant actors. The other theoretical point that this seems to resonate with is the work of Rainey and Wellman and their notion of networked individualism. So participant responses indicated a curvilinear relationship between connectedness within social networks and deception vulnerability. On the one end, the person may be viewed as susceptible to social engineering if they're socially isolated. On the other, being overconnected may also introduce points of vulnerability. While these dynamics may apply to other forms of deception more broadly, the perceived relationship between connectedness and social engineering vulnerability may be tied to the changing nature of social networking in the information age. So in Rainey and Wellman's work, they describe societies being characterized by networked individualism, where people are increasingly embedded in multiple diffuse social networks mediated through communication technologies to meet their various social, emotional, and economic needs. Networked individualism requires that individuals engage in, quote, remote relationships in both the physical and emotional sense of the word. They argue that networked individualism is both, quote, socially liberating and socially taxing, because it provides tremendous freedom to connect to others, but also places the onus on the individual to curate and maintain these relationships. Relevant to social engineering, increased reliance on remote relationships means that individuals have to keep track of relationships in sufficient detail to discern legitimate from illegitimate correspondences. They also must develop skills in discerning authenticity and trustworthiness across mediated communications. Further, it also places a greater burden on individuals to manicure their online identities to reduce their, quote, data exhaust, as Shoshana Zuboff calls it, the surplus data which can be mined from internet activities. In short, the particular character of contemporary social networks may create the conditions of social isolation and saturation in weak social ties that are thought to be exploitable by social engineers. And finally, the issue of regulation and control brought up by participants relates to Charles Tittle's control balance theory. Tittle argues that deviance or crime may stem from an individual experiencing too much control relative to the amount of control they exercise. As in, they have a lot of autonomy, and they don't have a whole lot constraining them. This is called a control surplus. Or they have too little, a control deficit. In other words, they experience a ton of control on themselves, but don't get to exercise a whole lot. In particular, this study supports Beccaro and Hickman's theoretical extension, which posits that both control deficits and surpluses increase victimization risks. They argue that, quote, individuals with control deficits do not have the confidence and or skills to defend themselves against those who may victimize them. Similarly, our study finds that a mark may be considered vulnerable, for example, because of a perceived tendency to acquiesce to authority, either due to a personal disposition or organizational policy and culture. Additionally, low-level employees or those in organizations with rigid rules and formal structures may become, quote, passive, withdrawn, and submissive, creating a situation in which the mark may respond to attempts by the social engineer to exploit their, quote, desire for autonomy. Regarding control surpluses, such individuals indirectly place themselves at risk for victimization because they come to perceive that there is relatively little to restrain their actions. In this sense, the mark may ignore information security risks because they may not feel that the rules apply to them or the situation due to feelings, quote, feelings of impunity, invulnerability, and untouchability. And so that is my analysis. Hopefully it is useful for some folks. And I look forward to anyone who wants to reach out and ask questions about it and hopefully get a chance to check it out. Thanks.